Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to day 2 in palette week, where every single day for 7 straight days I will be posting some sort of palette themed content. And today I am updating you on the palettes I would declutter from my collection if I had to choose one palette from each brand to declutter. I believe this is the 3rd time I've done this video. I will leave my previous links to my previous videos down below. My palette collection obviously has changed and changes pretty significantly throughout the year. I did do a big palette declutter last August, at least big for me, where I believe I decluttered 30, somewhere around 30 eyeshadow palettes. So my palette collection has changed, and obviously I have brought in quite a few new palettes to my collection as well. So it's always fun just to update this video. Plus I just love talking about eyeshadow palettes, and I just think this is such a fun one. So if you're interested in hearing about the eyeshadow palettes I personally would declutter from my collection if I had to choose one to declutter from each brand, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content or just chit-chatting about makeup, palette themed content, we've got it all over here. I hope you'll consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, I have my palettes stored in like a 6 cubby shelving unit. So I'm just gonna go cubby by cubby, not necessarily in any sort of brand specific order, but this video gets very messy in my like real life to film, just because I'm taking so many eyeshadow palettes out and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know why I'm explaining this, but here, let's go. Up first we have, oh, by the way, I posted my first palette week video yesterday. Was a chopping block video talking about eyeshadow palettes in my collection that I personally am considering decluttering. So some of these, if you watch that video, some of these might not come as a surprise, but there's also quite a few brands that like I am not considering decluttering anything from. So starting with the brand BH Cosmetics, I currently have 2 palettes in my collection from BH Cosmetics. I have the Weekend Festival palette, which has been in my collection for so long. I have loved this palette for so long. This palette is something that's on my chopping block, just because I'm like, I don't reach for this one that much, but there's also like a very nostalgic like feeling to this palette. I used to be like a festy gal as well, so like the festival kind of like theme of the palette also just like makes me happy inside. And then I also have the 90s Remix palette, which is newer in my collection than the Weekend Festival palette, but what was it? Where was I going with that? I've definitely reached for this one less. However, in terms of like wearability, I can get, this palette is more wearable every day to me than my Weekend Festival palette. I do have a very specific go-to look with this palette that I love, but in terms of variety and comfort, I feel like this is a palette I would reach for more often. So I actually think if I had to choose between these 2 palettes, I would declutter my Weekend Festival, and I can't believe I'm actually saying that. Thankfully I don't actually have to choose, and now that I'm like filming this video, I'm like, this is on my chopping block, but like I don't actually think I can declutter this one, and don't think I will. But if I had to choose between the 2, I think I would keep the 90s Remix and I would declutter the Weekend Festival. Next up we have Lunar Beauty, and I currently have 2 palettes from Lunar Beauty. By the way, I obviously am only sharing eyeshadow palettes from brands that I have 2 or more palettes from, but this is the Eternal, so I have the Eternal Eclipse palette, which is this one right here, and this is the one I'm keeping. I also have the Moonspell palette, which is the palette I would declutter if I had to declutter one. I love the packaging on the Moonspell palette, like packaging 10 out of 10 for Moonspell, but in terms of color story, I would absolutely get more use out of, and have gotten more use out of, I'm like, can't hold these things up today. I definitely get more use out of Lunar Eclipse than I do Moonspell. So if I had to choose, I would be decluttering Moonspell. Then we have Alter Ego, and I just realized there is a palette I didn't grab. I have a 3rd palette from Alter Ego. I have the one that is the dupe. Okay, I have 3 palettes from Alter Ego. I have the Harmony palette, which is the dupe for the Natasha Denona. Is it the retro? Retro? Not retro glam, but the retro. Ugh, can't remember. So I have the Harmony. I also have the Canyon palette, which is the dupe for the Natasha Denona bronze palette. And then I have the Artemis palette, which is the dupe for the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette. This is what this one looks like. And it's a very easy choice for me. If I had to choose one to declutter, I would choose the Harmony palette. 1, because I have the dupe, the Natasha Denona dupe. And 2, I just like the color stories better of the Artemis and the Canyon. So if I had to choose one from Alter Ego, I would be decluttering the Harmony. Next up, I have Alien Cosmetics, which I believe is Unearthly Cosmetics now. Is that correct? And I still just have 2 palettes from them. I am interested in purchasing more from them, but just haven't gotten around to it. So I have the Hauntingly Glamorous palette from them, and I don't know what, if any of these are still available. This is what the Hauntingly Glamorous looks like. And then I have the Alien Cosmetics Not Normal, and my answer is the same this year as it was last year. If I had to declutter one, it would be the Hauntingly Glamorous. This color story just speaks to me more than this one. And honestly, like the packaging of this one, this might be my favorite palette cover of all time. So if I had to declutter one from Unearthly Cosmetics, it would be the Hauntingly Glamorous, although the packaging on this one is also very beautiful. Next up, we have Glamlite, and I feel like I'm missing a Glamlite palette. Like I feel like I own more from Glamlite, but I actually have the Scooby-Doo palette on my eyes today. I used these 6 shades to create this green look right here. I also have the Chocolate Martini palette, which looks like this. Love this one so much. I am so impressed with Glamlite's formula every single time that I use their palettes. I just think they have a really, really, really great formula. It is definitely one of my tippity top favorite formulas of all of the eyeshadow formulas I've tried. This is the Ice Cream Dream palette. Really fun, colorful palette. I absolutely love the Glamlite shimmer formula, but the mattes in this one perform really well as well, especially considering it's like a very colorful palette. And then I also have the Cake palette, which is another very fun, colorful palette. But if I had to declutter one, it would be the Cake palette. In terms of color story, it came down to these 2 for considerations of declutter, and this one has more shimmers. I do really like this one, but I like the pastels in here. I'd be sad to get rid of either of these, any of my Glamlite palettes, because I do really love the formula, but this is the one that gets the least use and that I think I would miss the most. Looking at it though, I'm like, dang, I don't have these like bright, vibrant pops literally anywhere in my collection. So, and I also like looking at this, I'm like, I need to pull this out and have some fun with it. I'm like eyeing this peach shade right here that just looks like such a fun pop that I want to have some fun with. So hopefully this gets rolled into like my No Pan Left Behind in the summer. I feel like I could have a ton of fun with that, but I'm still decluttering this one if I had to choose one from Glamlite to declutter. Then I have Danessa Myricks, and I have 2 palettes from Danessa Myricks. I have the Lightwork Volume 3 as well as the Lightwork Volume 4. Ooh, this one's gonna be a tough choice. Okay, here is Lightwork Volume 3. I talk about this all the time when I talk about Danessa Myricks palettes. I truly have nothing like these anywhere in my collection, including my single shadows. The formulas are just so incredibly unique and stunning. You're getting just really, really beautiful multi-chrome shades. So I know that the palettes are very expensive, but in my opinion, I think they are worth it if you are looking for very unique, very special eyeshadow shades to add to your palette collection. These 4 large shades in this palette are really interestingly formulated and definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It definitely comes with a learning curve, but I actually really have come to enjoy at least these 2 shades right here, Aura and Intuition. They are kind of like water activated. These are very, very flaky, not flaky, but like shimmery flakes. Like if that is like the look you're going for, then you'll like these, but it's a very specific eyeshadow look, and I don't think it's gonna be for everyone. It's very like editorial, and these 2 aren't my favorite necessarily, but I do love the other well, 10 multi-chrome shades and then the 2 water activated shades. And while I do love this palette as well, especially this shade Polaris is this really unique cream shade that you can either use as a base, you can use as one shadow on its own, you can top it or layer these on top of Polaris just to kind of create even more shadows than just the 8 that you have in this palette. Love this palette so much, and I think I've definitely gotten more use out of this palette. This one's been in my life longer, but if I had to only keep one and I had to declutter one, I think I would keep Lightwork Volume 4, Declutter Volume 3, because there's more shades in this, I paid more money for it, and there's just also more color options to this palette. So if I had to declutter one from Danessa Myricks, it would be the Volume 3. You guys, I grabbed a new batch of palettes. Next up we have Dose of Colors. I have 3 eyeshadow palettes remaining in my collection from Dose of Colors. I have Baked Browns, always a classic. I have the Friendcation palette. Mine is very dirty, but this is my go-to country concert palette. Whenever I go to a country concert, this is the eyeshadow palette I reach for. I don't know why that is. And then the one I would declutter if I had to declutter one is Sassy Siennas. It's just the color story I reach for the least, and it's the palette I would miss the least. So that is what I would declutter from Dose of Colors. From Urban Decay, I have 4 eyeshadow palettes in my collection from Urban Decay. I have Stone Vibes, which I am so glad that I picked up. This was a limited edition holiday palette, and I absolutely love this palette. I think it's such a fun one. I'm hoping I can hit pan in the shade Meditate this year. Like, it's so close. I just need to actually do that. So love this palette. I also have the Urban Decay Naked Wild West palette. This is a nice palette. Just nothing special in my collection. I have Naked Honey, which I love for like a yellow golden moment. And then the Urban Decay eyeshadow palette I would declutter if I had to declutter one is going to be my Born to Run palette. This has just lived a very long life with me, and it's gotten a ton of use. As you can see, I have 3 pans in this, and pans do not come easy in this palette. I also have some just good wear on other shades in this palette, but I feel like this palette, it's just not something that I love reaching for anymore. I don't think the quality on this is that great anymore, and that's come with time. So if I had to declutter one from Urban Decay, it would definitely be my Born to Run. Next up we have Too Faced. I have a new palette from Too Faced. I did purchase the Italian Spritz palette, which is just so fun. Like, just such a fun color story. I truly couldn't resist. I also just love like everything about this, the packaging, etc. I have the Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette, a really great palette just for everyday neutrals. You get a little of everything in here. You have neutrals, mauves, and then like warm browns as well. So just as like a solid staple palette to have. And then I have the Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette, which is a really fun palette as well. And now I'm like, what would I choose? I don't think I would choose, I'm not gonna choose my brand new palette, because why would I? I think I'm gonna, I think I'm gonna have to go with the Pumpkin Spice. I still really enjoy this palette. I think it's really nice. There are some shades that are better than others, certainly in this palette. There's some that are a little bit more crumbly, some that aren't as intense on the eyes as I was hoping. And I just feel like the Too Faced Natural Nudes is such a staple to have that if I had to choose one to declutter, it would be the Pumpkin Spice. That was a tough one though. Next up we have Sigma. I have 3 palettes from Sigma. I have the Sigma Enchanted palette, which I used quite a bit last year and actually really enjoyed this palette. In fact, I currently have this palette pulled to get some more use out of it, or just to try and use it more throughout the month of March, because there's some fun pops of green in here, but there's also just some great tones for the springtime as well. So really enjoy that one. Love Sigma Corderosa. I think this is such a beautiful warm tone, peachy coral, just warm palette. I cannot wait to pull this palette out for the summer. I love the shade Belle of the Ball. Such a beautiful shimmer for the lids, and I really enjoyed that one. And if I had to choose one to declutter, it would have to be Sigma Untamed. This palette I still really enjoy. I love the color story. It's definitely a little bit grungier, but I find myself reaching for this one the least, just because I'm not going for like a super grungy look every day. Still think it's a great palette. This one definitely was a tough choice as well, but if I had to choose one to declutter from Sigma, it would be the Untamed. Next we have ABH, and am I really down to? Yes, I'm down to only 4 palettes from ABH. I remember when I had so many palettes from ABH. So we have my current Pan That palette. We have the ABH Sultry palette. Definitely would not be my choice to declutter. We also have my ABH Jackie palette, which you guys know is a favorite palette in my collection for so many years now. So also wouldn't be my choice to declutter. We have last year's release. This is the Nuevo palette, and I think this is just such a fun one for ABH. Something a little bit different. Like the color story, when I look into it, I feel a little bit confused, but every time I start to create looks with this palette, I feel really creatively inspired and have always really enjoyed the looks that I have created with this palette. So wouldn't be this one. If I had to declutter one from ABH, it would in fact be the ABH Norvina palette. I feel like I've considered decluttering this so many times, and every time I reach into this palette, I'm like, I've actually used this palette way more than I think I have, because I look and see all of the wear on some of the shades. I just feel like I was so excited for this palette to release, and it just didn't live up to like the expectations in my head. And every time I get excited to create a look with this palette, I feel like the look that I get is not what I intended going into it, and not necessarily in like a great way. Like this shade Soul looks so pretty in the pan, but on the eyes it definitely pulls more gray than it does purple, and I really struggle with some of the mattes in this palette. I do really enjoy the shimmers in this palette, which I feel like is why I keep this palette around. But if I had to declutter one from ABH, it would not even be a question. It would be the Norvina palette. Next up we have Patrick Ta. I have both Major Dimension 1 and 2 from Patrick Ta. Love both of these palettes. Here is Major Dimension 1, which would be the one I would keep. So if I had to declutter one from Patrick Ta, it would be the Major Dimension 2. I just prefer browns to like rosy pinks. That's really the only, like I love both of them, but I would keep the browns, toss the pinks if I had to make a choice. Wow, I have a lot more Pat McGrath than I thought, and I've actually decluttered some of my Pat McGrath. So I have way more Pat McGrath than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't realize I actually have 6 out of the, is it 10 motherships that she has come out with, which I did purchase 2 motherships at the very end of 2022, so I guess that makes sense. I wouldn't declutter any of my motherships. I'm not going to open them all up just because I feel like that's super time consuming. If I had to declutter one, so I actually really love this little quad. This is the Interstellar Icon quad. It wouldn't be that. It would be between the Voyeuristic Vixen quad and the, is this the Subliminal Bronze Temptation 6-pan, as well as, I'm opening the 3 up because I'm like, what would I, as well as the Rose Decadence. If I had to declutter one from Pat McGrath, I think it would be my Voyeuristic Vixen quad. This is nice, but I mean, it has one special shade in it, and it's just like, it gets a fine quad, but it's nothing earth-shattering to my collection. So if I had to declutter one from Pat McGrath, it would be the Voyeuristic Vixen quad. All right, new batch of palettes. Moving on to Kaleidos. I love my Kaleidos collection. I think they have amazing packaging, just so fun, great color stories. I mean, just everything about their packaging. I love quality of eyeshadow, really great as well. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Kaleidos palettes. I'm not going to open each one of these either. I have the Futurism 7 Sashimi City. I also have the Flower Punk palette. I have the Escape Pod. I have Club Nebula. Obviously all of those I would be keeping. My declutter comes down to Futurism 6, which is the Lunar Lavender, looks like this, as well as the Futurism 3 Astro Pink, looks like this. And I'm torn because I feel like the Futurism 3, I can get really good use day to day even out of these 3 shades, but don't really reach for this magenta shade or this black with micro glitter. And then we have the Lunar Lavender, which isn't necessarily like everyday, although I suppose I could wear that, and that. This is a toughie. I think last year I said I would declutter Lunar Lavender. I think this year I would keep Lunar Lavender and I would declutter Futurism 3. Just because there's something that is like feeling more inspiring about this color story to me. So I'm gonna say I would declutter the Futurism 3 Astro Pink from Kaleidos if I had to choose. Next up, moving on to Melt. I actually feel like I have more Melt than I thought, but then I'm like, I've also decluttered some Melt palettes. So I've owned a lot of Melt in my life. So I currently have 5 palettes from Melt. I have the Gemini palette, which is just a grungy classic. Love that one so much. I have the Rust palette. Looks like this. Also just a grungy gal's dream. I have the Smoke Sessions palette, which was my first ever Melt palette, and I've just come to love this palette even more. In fact, I should set this one aside and get some use out of this. Since we're feeling all the greens this month, I'm setting this aside as well. And then, what else do I have? I have Melt Mary Jane, which you guys know I've been ragging on this palette a little bit lately because this was just going in my No Pan Left Behind, and I forgot how difficult and frustrating this palette is to work with. These 2 shades right here are just so crumbly and so messy, but you can get such a beautiful, stunning, just smoky eye from this palette that makes it hard to hate this palette, but it is truly so frustrating to work with. And I think if I had to declutter one from Melt, it actually wouldn't be the Mary Jane, it would be the Melt Gemini 2. And it's really because I'm just not that into like rosy tones, I've realized. And these are like very rosy in my opinion. I do love the addition of the grunge down here, but this palette actually just like is not that inspiring to me at all. So I don't think I would miss the Melt Gemini 2 if I decluttered that one. Now, I'm not saying I'm actually going to declutter it, but if I had to choose one for Melt, it would definitely be the Gemini 2. Next up, we have Artist Couture. I have 3 of these Supreme palettes from Artist Couture, and if you caught my chopping block video, it should come as no surprise if I had to declutter one from Artist Couture, it would be the Supreme Mauves. This palette just, the quality was not the same as Supreme Nudes or Supreme Bronze, and really disappointing. Also, this is a more rosy tone palette. I do like this one isn't quite as pink, but quality of this one just is not there. So if I had to declutter one from Artist Couture, it would be Supreme Mauves. Next, I have Aether Beauty, and I actually just have 2 palettes from Aether Beauty. Both are these cute little quads. I have the Rose Quartz quad, which looks like this, as well as the Amartine quad, which looks like this. And if I had to declutter one from Aether Beauty, it would actually be the Rose Quartz quad, because I really like my Amartine, especially if I'm looking for something more like purple or mauve toned. And I just don't find the Rose Quartz one to be as impactful on the eyes. It's just not as fun. So if I had to declutter one from Aether, it would definitely be the Rose Quartz quad. From Lawless, another brand I just currently own 2 palettes from, I have the Baby One palette, which looks like this. And the Baby One palette is the one I would declutter if I had to declutter one, although I love this shimmer pink shade right here and would miss it so much. I also love this pink matte. It's a great palette. I love both of my Lawless palettes, but I would want to keep the Glam one for the color story. I just prefer it a little bit more to the Baby one. So if I had to choose one to declutter from Lawless, we're going with the Baby one. Next up, I have my 2 Rowan quads. I have the Rowan 75 Degrees quad, as well as Rowan 1111. And if I had to declutter one from Rowan, I actually would go with 75 Degrees. Although I get more use out of this one, I just love the tones and the color story of 75 Degrees, or of 1111. I think it's more unique to my collection, and I would prefer to declutter 75 Degrees if I had to choose. Next up is a brand that I own quite a bit from. I've owned more in the past, and I've actually been able to declutter some, but it is Nabla. I own quite a bit from Nabla, and if it came down to it, the 3 that I would be deciding between decluttering would be the Glorious Lights glitter palette, just because it is a glitter palette, which obviously I'm not reaching for very frequently. but it wouldn't be this one that I decide to declutter because I actually really love this when I want to glitter. It's a great quality formula. It sticks to the eyes and I love the impact that it has, so I would keep that. I also was considering decluttering in this hypothetical scenario the Dreamy 2 palette, which looks like this, or sorry, the Dreamy 1. I love the Dreamy 2, but I lost mine and I haven't repurchased it yet. I just don't find myself as inspired to reach into the Dreamy, the original Dreamy, and I just don't feel that creatively inspired when I reach into that. But ultimately, if I had to declutter one from Nabla, I am going with the Cutie Metropolitan palette just because I don't know what to do with this color story. I like this palette for the shade Dissolution as well as Alaska. I do want to do something with the shade Nothing Personal before I ultimately do declutter this, just to see, like, maybe I could end up depotting a couple of these shades, but this just is nothing special, and I truly look at this and I'm like, what do I even do with this palette? So quality is good, but I just don't feel inspired by that palette, so I would choose the Nabla Metropolitan to declutter if I had to choose one. I forgot that I also own the Melt Bad Side Zodiac palette in Earth. I wouldn't declutter this one, I would stick with the Gemini 2, but I just wanted to say that I forgot that I own that one. Next up we have Persona, and my answer is the same as it is every year. If I had to choose one from Persona to declutter, it would be the Identity 2, just because I love the Identity 1 so much. Just, it's such a staple, such a favorite. So if I had to declutter one from Persona, it would be the Persona Identity 2. From Nars, I am up to 5 Nars palettes in my collection. So I have the Summer Solstice palette, which I love so much. It is really similar to the new Rising Orgasm palette, which I also love so much. I've really been enjoying that. I have the Summer Unrated palette from last summer, which looks like this. I also have the Holiday palette from last holiday, the Stargaze palette, which looks like this. And then the palette I would declutter if I had to choose one to declutter is the Nars Climax palette. This is what this one looks like. I love the shimmer metallic formula in this palette, but the mattes just do not blend well together, and I find that they muddy together, and I just don't enjoy using the mattes in this palette, which is such a bummer because I love the shimmers in this palette. If I had to declutter one from Nars, it would be the Climax palette. From Adept Cosmetics, I own 3 of their palettes. I have the Heather Austin collab. So I was gonna say pretty and beautiful at the same time. I have the Ninhydrin, I don't know how to say that, palette, which is so stunning. My camera battery is about to die. And then the one I would actually declutter if I had to declutter one from Adept, but I would be upset about it because I love the Adept eyeshadows. I think they're so unique to my collection, but I would actually declutter the Plain Jane just because I prefer the fun shades that I'm getting in these two just a little bit more than the Plain Jane. So again, I would be very upset, very angry if I had to declutter this, but if I had to choose between the 3, Plain Jane Remastered is getting the boot. Okay, I obviously own a lot from Colourpop, so I'm going to split Colourpop up into 3 sections, and I'm going to talk about their quads first, which actually I'm down to only owning 3 of their quads. I have the Pisces in the Sky, the Capricorn in Charge. I just realized I have 4 because I forgot to grab my creamsicle one, but I also have Taurus, Never Taurus Apart. If I had to declutter one of my 4 Colourpop quads, it would be the Pisces in the Sky. I just like the color stories of the other ones that I have just a little bit more, so that would be the Colourpop quad that I would declutter. I currently own 2 of the large 30 pan palettes from Colourpop. I own the Stone Cold Fox, which looks like this. Very beautiful palette. And then I own Getting Fresh, which looks like this, which I feel like naturally would be a palette that I would keep just because I think it's has such fun pops. But this palette actually was not that impressive to me. In fact, this is one of the palettes I'm considering decluttering. We'll see after I try and go through and use every shade again. But if I had to choose between this and Stone Cold Fox, my current opinion is that I would declutter the Getting Fresh palette. And then I have a whole stack of other Colourpop palettes. I mean, I don't actually own that much from Colourpop considering how many eyeshadow palettes they have come out with and released. But out of my other stack of palettes, I don't want to go through every single one again just because I feel like there's quite a bit. I feel like it's not going to be a surprise to you guys. The Colourpop One and Done palette I was not happy with at all. I just thought this was really lacking in quality. I am convinced that Colourpop cannot make a blue brown shade. It is so dusty and lackluster on the eye. Every single Colourpop palette I get excited for a blue brown shade if it has a blue brown shade. Typically it's why I'm buying the palette. And then it's just this like dusty sheer nothingness. And it's just always such a letdown. And I love all of my other current Colourpop palettes. So if I had to choose one of my 9 to 12 pan palettes from Colourpop to declutter, it would be the One and Done. Because it was one use and done pretty much. And not really, I've used it more than one time, but truly it could have just been the one and I could have been done. I get why they named it that now. All right, moving on to another brand I own a ton from. We're gonna go into Natasha Denona, and I'm gonna split Natasha Denona up between my minis and then my midi / larger Natasha Denona palettes. So for my minis, I own the mini Biba, the mini Nude, the mini Retro, the mini Pastel, the mini Glam, the mini Love, and then if I had to declutter one of my Natasha Denona minis, it would have to be my Natasha Denona mini Gold, which shockingly the Natasha Denona Gold palette is one of my favorite palettes. It would definitely be between mini Glam as well as mini Gold. There is something about the mattes in each of these two that I just was not super impressed with. I will say I would be sad to be without these two shimmer shades in the Gold palette, but I'm just not reaching for this palette that much because I just don't love the looks that I've created with this mini palette. So if I had to declutter a mini from Natasha Denona, it would be the mini Gold. And I'm gonna be lazy, you guys, and I'm not gonna grab the rest of my Natasha Denona palette collection to share with you. I'm just being lazy and I don't want to have to take it off the shelf to put it back on the shelf. But the two that I would come down to out of my mini / large palette collection from Natasha Denona would be the Zendo palette and the Love palette in terms of if I had to declutter one. So the Zendo palette looks like this. And I love the color story. I think it's so fun, but I've just found the quality to be very inconsistent in this palette. There's some shades I really love. There's some shades that I just don't perform that well, but there's nothing about this palette that has really made me feel really special about this palette when I was so excited for this one. And then we have the Natasha Denona Love palette, which I just don't reach for pinks and purples all that much, which is why I'm like, although I will say the quality of the Love is definitely better than the Zendo. So actually, I was thinking I was gonna say the Love is what I would declutter, but I actually think I would declutter the Zendo because I can get the Zendo in other palettes in my collection, and I just don't think this one is special. It's one of the worst Natasha Denona palettes I've tried in terms of quality. So if I had to declutter one, although I will say the Circo Loco palette was not good, as well as the Safari. Those have since been decluttered from my collection. But if I had to choose one to declutter from Natasha, it would be the mini Zendo. Two brands left. I have Huda Beauty and Odin's Eye. Let's do Huda Beauty. Okay, so I'm gonna split Huda Beauty and talk about if I had to declutter one of my 9 pans, and then we'll talk about my larger Huda Beauty palettes. It was really tough, my 9 pan Huda Beauty, like to choose one that I would declutter, but I ultimately landed on the Coral Obsessions palette, and this was a really hard choice because I do love the Coral Obsessions palette. Clearly I have 2 pans in it. This is a palette that has come traveling with me on many a vacation, but I really do love all of my other palettes, although maybe I would declutter one of my nude ones actually, because I'm like, I do love this color story for the summer. Hold on. Okay, so between Nude Rich and Nude Medium, I think I would declutter Nude Rich just because it is a little bit deeper and rosy toned, so just not something I personally would reach for on an everyday basis. Although I do really love this color story, this palette, the shimmers. Very tough choice for me to decide, but if I had to declutter one of my Natasha 9 pans, it would be the Nude palette. And then for my larger Huda Beauty palettes, I again didn't pull everything out, but the bottom 2, or the 2 that I'm deciding between, would be the Naughty Nude palette, which looks like this, as well as the Rose Quartz palette, which looks like this, and it's such a tough choice. Such a tough choice because I love that the Naughty Nude has like some deeper like brown shades in it, but I love the like ethereal aesthetic of the Rose Quartz. Oh my gosh, I don't know what. Each time I feel like I've made my decision, I'm like, wait. I think if I had to declutter one, I would declutter the Naughty Nude because I feel like the Rose Quartz is a little bit more unique to my collection. So I'd rather keep these shades around. So if I had to choose a Natasha Denona, not Natasha Denona, Huda Beauty large palette, I still own Mercury Retrograde as well as the Empowered. So deciding between those four, I would decide to declutter Naughty Nude if I had to make a decision, but that would be a hard one too. And then the final brand is Odin's Eye, which Odin's Eye has my favorite eyeshadow formula by far right now. I just absolutely love them. I recently ordered the collab with Makeup Just for Fun, Lauren from Lauren May Beauty, and Betty Jean. So I would not declutter any of these. I haven't gotten around to finishing my testing process of those, but the first palette I purchased from Odin's Eye was the Salmon palette. My favorite shade in this palette did break, but I still do love this palette so much. I have the Hella palette in collaboration with Angie, just such a fun palette, love this one. I have the Norns palette, which is such a fun color story as well. The Christmas Eve as well as the Christmas palettes from holiday this year, oh my goodness, were these stunning palettes. Like truly just wow. Then I have the Elva 2 palette, which I think is just so beautiful for the springtime. I'm actually so excited to pull this back out very soon. And then the three that I would be deciding between decluttering would be my Alva Mini Forest, which looks like this. I also would consider the Verdandi palette, which I just included in my chopping block palette, as well as the Saga Freya. And it really does come down to these two. It's just the color story and the quality of these weren't quite what I would be searching for. If I had to declutter one, I would choose the Verdandi because I think I could get more use out of the Freya than I could the Verdandi palette. So from Odin's Eye, if I had to declutter one, thank goodness I wouldn't have to choose just one because that would be so difficult, which I will film probably for my next palette week at the end of July or June. I will film if I had to choose only one to keep from each brand. But today we're talking about if I had to declutter one, and if I had to declutter one from Odin's Eye, it would be my Verdandi palette. But whew, I'm looking at a mess on my desk. After that, that is going to conclude today's video talking about the eyeshadow palette from each brand. I own more than one brand palette from each palette that I would declutter if I had to choose one to declutter. I would love to know, did you disagree with any of my choices? What are your thoughts? What are some palettes that you're considering decluttering? Let me know in the comments. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video, for supporting my channel, for supporting me, for supporting Palette Week. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.